Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating psychological paper from 1999 by Justin Kruger and David Dunning. Think about it. Have you ever interacted with someone who was absolutely terrible at a task, yet completely, totally, unapologetically convinced that they were amazing at it? I mean, we all have, right? Well, this study, famously titled Unskilled and Unaware of It, investigates exactly why incompetent people are so incredibly confident. To set up this whole mystery of human overconfidence, the authors actually turned to a quote from Charles Darwin from well over a century ago. Darwin said, "Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge." It's a pretty profound observation, but Kruger and Dunning wanted to know the actual psychological mechanics behind it. Like, why exactly does ignorance create such a strong, almost impenetrable shield of confidence? To answer that, they kick off their paper with an unbelievably bizarre real-world example. Picture this. It's 1995, and a man named MacArthur Wheeler walks into two Pittsburgh banks and robs them in broad daylight. The catch? He was wearing absolutely no masks or disguises. Literally nothing. So naturally, he was arrested less than an hour after the surveillance tapes hit the evening news. But here's the crazy part. When the police showed him the tapes, Wheeler was genuinely shocked. He just stared in total disbelief and muttered, "But I wore the juice." He legitimately believed that because lemon juice is used as invisible ink, rubbing it all over his face made him completely invisible to security cameras. You can't make this stuff up. Okay, so let's really dive into this. How on earth can someone be so astonishingly unskilled, yet so completely unaware of their own incompetence? How do you come up with a theory like the lemon juice hypothesis and actually feel confident enough to test it out by robbing a bank? Well, we're going to frame our investigation around this bizarre cognitive blind spot, using the incredible psychological experiments conducted by Kruger and Dunning. Section 1. The dual burden, blind to incompetence. Now, this right here is the underlying psychological theory that explains Wheeler's wild lemon juice logic, and it forms the entire foundation of the researchers' hypothesis. They propose that incompetent individuals lack what cognitive psychologists call metacognition. Basically, this is your ability to know how well you're performing, and to distinguish when you're accurate from when you're making an error. So the absolute crucial point is this. The exact same skills you need to be competent at a task are the exact same skills you need to evaluate your own competence. Think about it. If you don't know the rules of grammar, you don't just write badly, you also lack the ability to realize you've written badly. You suffer what they call a dual burden. Based on this idea of the dual burden, the researchers mapped out 4 core predictions for their investigation. First up, incompetent individuals will dramatically overestimate their ability compared to objective reality. Second, they'll suffer from deficient metacognitive skills, meaning they just can't recognize real competence when they see it. Third, because they can't recognize competence, they can't use social comparison. Like looking at a peer's superior work won't help them realize their own shortcomings. And fourth, the only actual way to gain self-insight is to, well, gain competence. Section 2. Putting ignorance to the test. So, to prove these predictions, the psychologists decided to start by testing something highly subjective: humor. They had participants rate how funny certain jokes were and then compared those ratings to a panel of professional comedians. Now notice that massive gap on the chart. The bottom quartile, the least competent participants, scored way down in the 12th percentile for actual test performance. But look at that marker right above it. They wildly overestimated themselves, completely believing their ability to recognize humor put them way up in the 58th percentile. In their minds, they were above average. Let's move on and see how this plays out in a much more objective domain. The researchers replicated the exact same study, but this time using an LSAT logical reasoning test. Now, humor might be subjective, sure, but logic? Logic has definitive right and wrong answers, and yet this exact same miscalibration happened. The bottom quartile scored in the 12th percentile again. But get this, they estimated their general logical reasoning ability to be up at the 68th percentile. They honestly thought they answered about 14 questions correctly, when in reality, they were averaging fewer than 10. But hold on, remember prediction number 3, the one about whether they can learn by comparing themselves to others? Well, in study 3, using a grammar test, the researchers had participants actually grade the tests of their peers. Now, a normal person might look at a classmate's superior grammar test and think, wow, okay, I clearly didn't know those rules, I must have done poorly. Not these guys. The bottom quartile participants could not recognize the competence right in front of them. Because of that lack of metacognition, even when shown much better answers, they totally failed to realize their own poor performance. They literally learned nothing from the social comparison. Section 3. The competence paradox, curing the illusion. So if showing them clearly better work doesn't cure this overwhelming overconfidence, the researchers knew they had to try something way more radical. They asked the logical next question, can we actually fix this incompetence? Like, is there any way to force the unskilled to realize that they are in fact unskilled? This perfectly sets up their fourth study, which tests that incredible paradox he mentioned earlier, the idea that the absolute only way to cure the illusion of competence is to actually make the person competent. To test this out, the researchers set up Study 4 with a few specific steps. Step 1, they gave participants a logic test and asked them to guess their score. Step 2, they gave a short but highly effective training session on logical reasoning to just half the group. And Step 3, they had those newly trained participants go back, review their original tests, and re-estimate how many they got right. Essentially, they were actively trying to give those incompetent participants the very metacognitive skills they were missing in the first place. And wow, the realization was dramatic. For the bottom quartile participants who actually got the training, their self-estimation absolutely collapsed, from 5.5 down to 1.0. Before the training, they were terribly unskilled, but confidently believed they'd gotten 5.5 questions right out of 10. In reality, they averaged just 0.3 correct. Barely anything. But after the training gave them the metacognitive skills to finally understand the rules of logic, they looked back at their old tests and realized they had failed miserably, dropping their own estimate all the way down to just 1.0. That training finally shattered the delusion. If you look at the bottom quartile here, the gap between their perceived ability and actual performance drastically narrows after the training. It perfectly proves the paradox, right? The training provided the bottom quartile with the actual skills necessary to recognize the limitations of their own ability. You can't just tell an incompetent person they're wrong. It doesn't work. You actually have to teach them the skills of the domain so they can finally see the error of their own ways. Section 4. The burden of expertise, the other extreme. Now, while Kruger and Dunning were spending all this time focusing on the incompetent, the data actually revealed a massive surprise twist about the other end of the spectrum. The highly competent people have their very own unique systematic bias. Let's contrast these two extremes for a second. We've established that the bottom quartile's miscalibration is an error about the self, right? They lack the metacognitive skill to see their own errors. But look back at all the top quartiles in those past charts. They consistently underestimated their percentile ranking. This is an error about others. It's known as the false consensus effect. Basically, because the top performers find the tasks so incredibly easy, they falsely assume that everyone else must find them just as easy. They know they did a great job, but they wrongly assume all their peers did just as well. To wrap up this explainer, the paper leaves us with this brilliant quote from Thomas Jefferson. He who knows best knows how little he knows. This whole study completely reframes how we look at confidence. So the next time you feel absolutely certain that you've mastered a new skill, take a quick moment to ask yourself, do I actually know what I'm doing, or am I just lacking the metacognition to see my own mistakes? Thanks so much for exploring the fascinating Dunning-Kruger effect with us today. And remember to always keep questioning what you think you know.